On November 3, 2002 at 9:12 a.m., a call came in from a construction crew demolishing an old warehouse on the outskirts of town in Springfield, Missouri. The workers had torn open a concrete wall and found a metal cabinet sealed inside. The cabinet doors were locked with chains that had rusted through with age. When police officers opened them, they found 2 human bodies inside, wrapped in plastic wrap with multiple layers of adhesive tape. One of the victims had her facial skin removed with surgical precision. The other had her fingertips cut off at the root. Both victims were in a sitting position, squeezed into a narrow space. There was a strong smell of decay and chemicals inside. This was the beginning of one of the darkest cases in Greene County history. A black plastic container was found at the bottom of the closet. Inside were household gloves, 2 hacksaws with dried organic matter, duct tape, a roll of cling film, and a stack of paper with handwritten notes. On one page, "Those who scream when they are cut sound different, some too loud." Experts immediately determined the approximate time of death, 1996, 1998. Both victims were women. One was presumably 25 years old. The other was about 40. Strangulation. No signs of sexual violence were found. The nature of the injuries ruled out a domestic motive. The murders were committed with cold, methodical precision. Both were cleared of hair. According to investigators, the killer spent hours preparing the bodies. The next day, the police found out that the warehouse belonged to a bankrupt construction company that ceased operations in 1987. However, the concrete filling had been done later. Based on the composition of the cement and the nature of the tools used in the work, experts determined that the premises had been refurbished around 1995-1997. One of the plastic bags retained a serial number, allowing the batch of packaging to be traced back to a local hardware store in 1999 using a credit card in the name of Joseph Lane. Joseph Lane, 39, a car mechanic, lived with his mother on Bricks Road. No criminal record, no complaints from neighbors. Had a license to work with technical equipment, several hobbies, modeling, fishing, photography. Led a secluded life, was polite, but avoided talking to strangers. The police arrived at the house on November 5th. Lane met them at the door, unconcerned. He agreed to be questioned. At first, he claimed that he knew nothing about the warehouse. However, when the investigator named the batch number of the tape and showed photos from the scene, Lane fell silent. After 40 seconds, he asked to stop the questioning, after which he tried to leave the building. He was detained. At the same time, a search was conducted in the house. Nothing suspicious. Clean, tidy. In the basement, there was a small garage where Joseph kept tools and worked on cars. It looked like an ordinary utility room. However, the concrete floor revealed the presence of a walled-up compartment. After opening it, the officers discovered a secret chamber with a metal lid. Inside are 27 plastic boxes, each with markings, date, coding, initials. The boxes contain documents, old driver's licenses, compact cassettes, audio recordings, clothing items, and fragments of human bones. Some of the bones have been ground down and cleaned of organic matter. One of the boxes contains a jawbone with a prosthesis. Another contains hair, neatly combed and tied with a rope. At the same time, Lane's mother, Susan Lane, 62, was questioned by the police. The woman led a quiet life, living with her son for the last 20 years. According to her, Joseph was a quiet child, suffered from asthma, had no friends, and became completely withdrawn after his father's death. He worked in a garage, was not interested in women, did not drink, and did not have conflicts. When asked if she had visited his workshop, she replied, "No, I respected his boundaries." The investigation officially acknowledged that the case was connected not with one, but with a series of murders. All the evidence pointed to a system. One of the tapes, listened to that same evening, contained sounds, a woman crying, metallic sounds, repeated blows, then silence. Officially, at least 9 victims were announced. All were women, all had different social profiles, and were not connected to each other. The crimes did not have a single pattern, except for the final one: disappearance without a trace, no bodies, and no witnesses. Thus began an investigation that would become one of the strangest and most frightening cases in Missouri in the last 50 years. The contents of the boxes from Joseph Lane's basement were turned over to the county crime lab. Experts immediately began analyzing them. The first task was to establish the identity of the victims. Of the 27 boxes, 19 contained personal items: driver's licenses, library cards, health insurance cards. On most of the documents, the names and photographs were damaged, blurred, partially burned or cut in half. Only 5 of the IDs were intact. They were used to identify 5 women who disappeared in different years in different counties: Boone, Taylor, Jasper, Green, and Lawson. All of them disappeared between 1993 and 2001. Their ages ranged from 18 to 45. No connection was found between the victims. They did not work in the same field, did not live in the same area, and did not know each other. The only thing they had in common was that they all disappeared without a trace, and none of the cases were solved. 2 of them were listed as having voluntarily left home. One of the tapes found in a box marked V13 had a male voiceover recorded on it. The opening line, verbatim, "Entry 13. This one is silent. I wonder for how long." Then there's silence. 5 minutes of video noise. Then the mechanical sound of a saw and the sound of muffled breathing. The last 10 seconds are rustling, grinding metal, and a short, muffled "done." Most of the tapes were damaged. The film was creased or torn. However, the restoration of several allowed us to create a rough picture of what happened. One of the recordings shows a motionless woman strapped to a table with metal belts. The camera does not move. Only footsteps, the clicking of a tool, and a monotonous voice pronouncing dates are audible. Experts did not publish the video recordings, but confirmed their authenticity. The key episode was the discovery of a small notebook with handwritten notes. The text was neat in capital letters. Everything was structured by month and year. The notes included strange terms: prepared, cleaned, breathing control, first silence. The remains are in the core. None of the wording made any legal sense, but the matches with the disappearance dates were precise. Notably, the column 4 March 1998 read, "Double test, result unstable." Police speculated that this might be related to the discovery of 2 bodies in a single compartment in a warehouse. The following lines contain repeated references to numbers: 09, 13, 18. These codes were later found on both the tapes and the boxes. During this time, Lane's mother remained under observation. She was shown the finds. She recognized one of the photographs, a girl named Carolyn, who had visited the house several times in the late 1990s. According to Susan, Carolyn was quiet and very polite. Her son said he helped her with car repairs. After 1999, she was no longer present. The police had no doubts. Susan had lived in the same house with a serial killer and had not suspected it for 20 years. No screams, no smells, no sounds. The basement was soundproofed. Joseph's behavior in the isolation ward remained calm. He refused food and barely spoke. He answered any questions with one phrase: "You found what you were looking for. Why ask now?" Psychiatrists began observation. The first assessment was the absence of signs of delirium or hallucinations. Lane demonstrated logic and showed no emotion. When asked to explain his motives, he said, "They weren't who they said they were. I was just helping to take off the excess." The investigative team began cross-checking archives across Missouri and neighboring states. It became clear that most of the victims had nothing in common: no roots, no professions, no behavioral signs. The murders were not impulsive, but systematic. Victim selection, fixation, destruction of traces, cataloging. Everything pointed to a methodical approach comparable to a laboratory test procedure. At this point, the police didn't know yet. They had only found the top on the 3rd day after the Lane basement was opened. State police began searching old databases, including ones that had not previously been considered criminal. They focused on missing persons reports closed with the wording "unauthorized departure" or "no confirmed evidence of a crime." It turned out that there were dozens of such cases, and in some counties, hundreds. They included the disappearances of women between the ages of 16 and 45, most of whom had no permanent jobs, no social connections, or lived alone. A missing persons report for 28-year-old Lorena Weiss, filed in 1997, was found in the Joplin, Missouri archives. The case was closed after 40 days, with police concluding that the woman had left of her own accord. However, in box number 9 from Lane's basement, they found an ID in Lorena's name, as well as an engraved button from the private tailor shop where she worked. The tape, labeled 09CL, contained a series of clicks, followed by strange phrases: "Don't look at me," "Extra eyes hurt." The soundtrack lasted just under 3 minutes. The last sounds were retreating footsteps and a sharp metallic screech, like a hatch closing. A separate metal box, locked with a combination lock, was also found in the basement. After opening it, it turned out that inside were samples of skin, fabric, and hair follicles, each in a separate sealed capsule. On the lids were dates applied with a marker. Some were a year apart. This indicated long-term storage and, probably, a return to the bodies or material after a while. The question was raised, how could such a complex organization of crimes have gone undetected for almost a decade? Lane's neighbors told investigators that they never heard screams, strange sounds, or smells. One neighbor noted that Joseph's garage was oddly insulated. The windows were always closed in the summer, and there was no steam coming out of them in the winter. The house also had a separate ventilation system that was not connected to the rest of the building. In one of the drawings found in his desk, investigators found a diagram of an air duct that went underground, under the garden, toward an old, dilapidated barn. When the police broke into the shed, they found a second secret chamber inside. It contained a wooden bench with bolts in the center. On the sides were spotlights connected to a car battery. Next to it was a box of videotapes, most of which were blank. However, one of them, labeled Test V15, contained a short recording of the camera slowly panning around an empty room, then stopping on a woman's face. Her eyes were closed, her skin was pale, and there were abrasions on her lips. A voice could be heard off-screen. "This one is not that one, but it is coming." The examination showed that the room in the recording was identical to the cell in the barn. The dents and screw marks on the wooden wall matched each other. Investigators concluded that Lane used two separate locations, one for isolation and restraint, and one for storing evidence and debris. Neither was connected to central utilities. At the same time, the FBI began investigating missing women within a 300-mile radius of Springfield. Some of the victims, it turned out, were registered in different states: Arkansas, Illinois, Kansas. At the time of the discovery of the basement materials, police believed that Lane could be involved in at least 15 disappearances. However, the number of boxes, tapes, and materials clearly exceeded this number. When Susan Lane was brought back in for questioning, she was struggling to maintain her composure. She was asked to identify several items from Box 4. Among them were a pendant with the letter A, a note in a woman's handwriting, and a photograph of a young woman with long blonde hair. Susan recognized the pendant as belonging to a girl named Amelia who had come to visit Joseph in 1995. The woman said, "I thought she left. He said she didn't want to talk anymore." The conclusion was clear. Susan lived in a house where people were disappearing. She drank tea in the kitchen while her son conducted tests in the basement. The psychologists who worked with her recorded signs of emotional shock, but did not find any behavioral pathologies. The woman was not an accomplice. She really knew nothing. Meanwhile, criminal cataloging experts were brought in to investigate. They confirmed that Lane's actions were not spontaneous. He kept an archive, numbered the tapes, collected samples, recorded the results. He did not try to destroy evidence. On the contrary, he collected it as evidence for himself. The next stage of the investigation was to answer the key question: was this a morbid attraction or a rational, calculated process? In the fourth week of the investigation, the investigative team received a transcript of the diary entries found in the basement. One of the notebooks, kept under the lid of a metal box, contained descriptions of the actions performed on the victims, recorded step by step. The column for initial reaction contained short notes: panicking, crying, apathy. The next column contained time until silence. In most cases, from the beginning of contact until complete silence occurred, it took between 2 and 6 hours. Opposite sum was not reached, and a black line. Apparently, Lane kept statistics not only of events, but also of psychophysical reactions. One of the sheets was titled Threshold Behavior During Fixation Without Contact. Investigators put forward a version that the criminal was deliberately testing how long a person could remain conscious or react to what was happening while in complete isolation. These tests were conducted before the physical impacts began. In confirmation of this, only sounds are heard on one of the recordings: footsteps, the clicking of metal elements, and fading noise. Not a single word for 47 minutes. St. Louis forensic psychiatry experts concluded that Lane likely had synesthetic perception. He described the screams as a sharp, piercing noise that interfered with his thinking. One document includes the expression, "When silence is achieved, correct perception begins. Everything else is body noise." This kind of recording of the victim's emotional and vocal reactions is not typical of serial killers. It did not indicate impulsive desires, but a sophisticated attempt at control, not over their bodies, but over their state. This explains why many victims showed no signs of resistance. They were isolated until panic set in. Silence is the final stage. One of the tapes, labeled S03, contained a series of phrases spoken in a muffled voice. A translation of the technical terms written in the diary showed that S could stand for sensory deprivation. The footage showed a woman with her eyes closed, in complete darkness. The camera recorded that the room was completely painted black, with no light sources other than infrared lighting. A voice could be heard off-screen. 12 o'clock. No answer. Total silence. Ready. The next frame shows an empty room. Police began checking the National Missing Persons database. They found that some of the women who disappeared in the 1990s may have been traveling for work. One of them, a nurse from Topeka, Kansas, went missing while visiting her mother. Her name, Virginia Holden, appeared in one of the notebooks, abbreviated as VH0998. Box 21 contained a pendant with an engraved letter V and a fragment of a hospital card with the logo of a hospital in Topeka. At this point, the investigation concluded that the murders were not limited to one county. Lane apparently traveled outside the state, choosing victims at random. However, the randomness was only in the choice. Everything else, the structure, the isolation, the fixation, the silence, followed a clear algorithm. One of the most disturbing discoveries was made in a folder of unsorted documents. On a scrap of paper was a phrase written in black ink. "I listened to them fall silent." That's the result. It contained neither a date nor a signature, but the handwriting matched that used on the tapes and recordings. Lane remained in custody. His condition remained stable. He did not confess, but did not deny participation in the murders. During interrogations, he remained silent. When shown one of the recordings, he only said, "Then at least you hear what I heard." Forensic experts who worked with the materials confirmed that in several cases the women's bodies had been partially mummified, artificially dried tissue, probably for the purpose of preservation. A thermostat was found in the basement with markings on its body, 30 degrees Celsius through 12H G 20%. The device was not part of the usual technical equipment. It was assembled manually from heating elements and a ventilation system. This indicated another goal: preserving the bodies not in a destroyed state, but in a controlled one. The question of the criminal's motivation became less and less clear. The crimes did not correspond to the classic signs. There was no sexual component, no rage. Instead, silence, control, analysis. Each victim was part of a process, and Lane seemed to view them not as individuals, but as parameters. The next step was to open a wooden cabinet in the farthest corner of the barn. According to preliminary information, the last and possibly key materials could be inside. On December 15, 2002, investigators opened a wooden cabinet found in the back of a shed behind Lane's house. The cabinet was locked with an internal latch and reinforced with metal corners driven into the outside. When opened, they found that the inside of the walls and doors were lined with soundproofing foam. Inside were 6 plastic containers, hermetically sealed. Each was labeled ER1, T, ER2, P, ER3, L, and so on. The first container contained fragments of mummified tissue, neatly folded, showing no signs of decay. On the bottom was a label, cleaned, retained odor, 96E. The second contained skeletal remains, which experts later identified as an anatomically accurate assembly of bones from 3 different bodies. The spine, femur, and skull were from different women. All the elements were connected with plastic ties. The skull had been painted with a marker. Red lines ran across the surface, resembling diagrams. The third container contained glass flasks containing nails, teeth, and hair. The flasks had numbers and signatures. None of the signatures contained names, only codes, ER9.1, T, 13.2, L, and so on. According to preliminary examination, most of the samples belonged to victims whose bodies have not yet been found. On the back wall of the cabinet was a board with nails on which hung 9 tokens with numbers engraved on them. Under each was a signature: ready, distorted, broken, long. Experts assumed that these were subjective assessments of the victims by Lane. One particular object was of particular interest: a metal cylinder about 50 cm long with a slit in the middle. Inside was a VHS-type cassette, sealed in a hermetically sealed case. After opening the tape, it turned out that the recording had been made in one of the cameras, but did not contain an image of the victim. Only an empty room a voiceover, and a series of phrases spoken almost in a whisper. The body breathes in its own way. I hear it leaving. All that remains is not it. Psychiatrists concluded that Lane probably had a severe depersonalization complex. He perceived his victims as mechanisms that could be switched off, disassembled, and fixed. This explained his methodical approach, not killing for the sake of aggression, but isolation as a cleansing tool. The last container, labeled Archive, contained a diary. Scratched on the cover was the phrase, "I've never heard silence until them." Inside are tables, drawings, chamber diagrams, calculations on holding time, humidity, temperature, not a single emotional statement, only numbers. Joseph Lane's trial began in March 2003. The prosecution relied on physical evidence, videotapes, biological materials, and diaries. Lane did not testify. He answered all questions the same way. They knew why they came. A psychiatric examination found him sane. He did not suffer from any disorder that interfered with his understanding of what was happening. His actions were conscious and purposeful. During the investigation, the identities of 11 victims were officially confirmed. The remains of 7 others have not yet been identified. About 9 women are still missing, and their connection to the Lane case has not yet been confirmed. Susan Lane, the defendant's mother, moved from Springfield after the trial was completed. Her final statement was recorded in June 2003. "I lived with him, I fed him, I talked to him every day, but I never heard him think, and that's the scariest thing." The Lane case has become the subject of academic study. It differs from most serial murder cases in that there is no emotional motivation, aggression, or sexual component. Instead, there is isolation, surveillance, fixation, psychological destruction before physical. In official reports, investigators described him as a killer who sought not death, but the disabling of human perception. Everything he did was an attempt to achieve absolute silence, and only then to leave a trace.